to the SCI-AI podcast. This is episode number 14. Today, my guest is the best-selling author of Crossing the Chasm, Zone to Win, and just recently published The Infinite Staircase, What the Universe Tells Us About Life, Ethics, and Morality. Crossing the Chasm is what I had studied during my MBA at Boston, and I feel so proud that, I'm actually going to talk to Geoff today. I'm an ardent follower of his work, since then. Geoff is also a startup investor and consultant at Wildcat Venture Partners, Google, Microsoft, Salesforce, you name the company, and he has consulted and provided his leadership there. I call him one of the world's best business strategists. He has a Bachelors from Stanford and a Ph.D. in English literature from University of Washington. He has been a storyteller most of his life. No wonder he has filled our lives with so many great stories in nonfiction categories in business management all his life. It is an honor and privilege to have Geoff on this podcast. So, hello, Geoff. How are you doing today?
Vivek, it's a pleasure to be here. And you're in Sweden and I'm in California, but we're talking and I love it.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Fantastic. The online world has changed everything for us. Sure, Geoff. Then let's go ahead and get started. So when companies claim that they are in a hypergrowth stage, what is more relevant for the founders? The strategic direction laid down by the investors or maintaining a healthy company culture? Why I ask is that startups are usually on a slippery slope when it comes to understanding how to retain their resources and use them efficiently. What do you think about it?
Well, when you're doing, and this is a classic venture agenda where hypergrowth is, you're really catching a wave of adoption. And when you're doing that, there's a lot of variables that are very uncertain, and you have to do a lot of sort of course correction as you go along. So the key to that is to have clear North Star vision and values. Because and this is something that the board cannot provide. This is something the founder has to provide to the team. What is our vision and what are our values? And when that's clear, then everybody on the team can navigate somewhat in parallel with other people, and you can do decisions more locally because everybody kind of knows where we're headed. If you try to step back and be more bureaucratic or more doctrinaire, then people have to hesitate. They have to go ask permission, and you don't catch the wave. So I think culture is hugely important. I don't think the board's job is to manage the company. I think the board's job is to endorse the vision and values, but then let the founder run the company.
Great one. Yeah. Let me go on to a different tangent related to some philosophical terms. What is going on? How do we decipher what is the meaning of life and why do we exist?
Well, this does relate to the latest book, The Infinite Staircase.
Yes.
Yeah, what the universe has to tell us about life, ethics, and mortality. And so part of it, the answer that it came together with, for a long time, by the way, those answers came from religion. And what we're saying in modern society is that if that works for you, that's fine. But for a lot of people, a more secular worldview is what they want to embrace. And what's been challenging is that there's really quite good answers to these questions, but they're in silos, just like we often see silos in business. And so what I wanted to do was sort of stretch it together into one end-to-end story. And it had sort of three sections. There was a section around why do we physically exist, sort of starts with the Big Bang. And it follows the second law of thermodynamics as if it's a great river. And that river is going from very high order to low order. But like a river, it can spin up complex structures and do work in the meantime. And all that work is essentially what's created, matter, which created Earth and the sun, and et cetera. And then, by the way, the second piece of it is on Earth. We began to be able to create not only systems that stabilized around a static equilibrium, like crystals and rocks, but we also were able to create systems that spin up in dynamic equilibrium, like tornadoes and eventually like cells, and which keep themselves going. And so the physical existence of life actually is an unintended consequence of entropy, of the second law of thermodynamics. So that was the physical thing. Having said that, the real question is, but what does it all mean? And why are we here? And that led to the second and third parts of the story. The second part was about Darwinism. How do you get from like single cells to very complex animals right before humans, or maybe early humans? But how do you get from there? And that is natural selection and sexual selection. How does that work? And that's a pretty compelling story, and it's pretty well known. And then the third section is what happens when you introduce language into the equation. And I talk about going from the Darwinism of genes, selecting for genes, which are strategies for living, to the selection for memes or ideas, strategies for living. And so, and then in that part, we talk about narratives and analytics. And what we say is, in terms of what's the meaning of everything, we say the meaning lies in a story that we embrace. It could be a religious story, it could be a secular story, but each of us embraces a story about our lives, what we want them to mean. And then it's our job to live those stories out, which is where ethics comes in. And there's a time limit that's where mortality came in. There's a time limit to that game. So anyway, that's a lot to talk about, but I care about the book a ton. I hope people will have a chance to look at it. And frankly, there's a blog that they can give their thoughts about these questions.
Yes. And it's fantastic because we have seen you evolve from a business management guru to, now to physics topics. It's just fascinating. I cannot wait to actually get that into my hand and read The Infinite Staircase as soon as possible. Let me ask you a connected topic. What is consciousness? How did evolution choose us to become sentient?
If we go back to that early Darwinistic phase, there were single cells. And basically what would happen is a single cell would emit a chemical that would trigger another cell to do something and emit another chemical. And eventually these created feedback loops where we began to sort of scratch each other's itches. And it was chemical signaling. It was all done by chemicals. And then what happened is somewhere along the line, we developed nerve cells who could do it much faster through electrical signaling. And so now instead of having to diffuse the message, you could actually just send it. And that led to mobility. And with electrical signaling, now you can respond fast enough to be mobile. But you're not thinking. You're just essentially reflex actions. But the reflex actions, and then we have Darwinism selecting. It's a competitive environment. So better, more alert reflexes do better than less ones. And the more sentient you can be, and it's gradual, but even a little gain in sentience will allow you to outperform the person who has the cell that has no sentience. So we started building more complex organs, more complex tissues, organisms, etc. And consciousness emerges and we become aware. But again, I think aware in the sense that I'm sentient, not yet self-aware, not like people, because that has to come with language later on. And so that's kind of where it goes. But you're always having an increasingly successful strategy for living, which is what's being selected for, and eventually get to humans with language, which has been an amazing enabler of strategies for living. So that's kind of where it goes.
Fantastic. Can I ask a bit follow-up on that? Is that why this incrementalism in this being, this biological being? Why not in an animal who cannot think like us? Why not in a plant? Because a plant is a plant for like 4 billion years. An animal is an animal because of evolution, they might have evolved. But why is it this intelligent being evolving every second of his life? How did evolution and like the use of language and all chose us to make that incremental?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, first of all, they still are evolving, right? I mean, as we're seeing climate change and global warming, species, they did the finches in Darwin's Galapagos, and how the beak of the finch changes with the droughts or with whatever. But having said all that, language is the game changer, because language allows you to transmit strategies across people, across time zones, across eras. So we can read Plato, who was alive 2,000 years ago. No deer can profit from a deer that was 2,000 years old, but we came from a human being. So I think language is the huge game changer there, and that's what lets us tell stories, and then it lets us analyze those stories to all the map. And by the way, we can use not only natural language analytics, we can use mathematical analytics, second language, and so that's where we've been able to move much faster. The amount of progress, the amount of change that we've embraced as human beings is just exponentially faster than anything that's ever appeared before.
So in your book, Zone to Win, you mentioned that big enterprises are usually challenged by innovations. Is it due to many layers of authority, or because the owners or the board members don't know or don't have a bottom-up approach in understanding the pain areas of the people working for them? For example, Google, Amazon, Facebook, are then obviously exceptions because of the kind of innovation that is happening in their companies. Can you decipher that difference and talk about it, please?
Yeah, it's important. In fact, this is at the core of Zone to Win. It's also at the core of business consulting. So when a company becomes successful, it develops inertial momentum around its business model, its operating model, its install base, its ecosystem. And as long as we are essentially incrementally and continuously improving that, it's very innovative. Secondly, it's not that they don't see the new innovation, but what happens is when you try to implement the new innovation, it's now cannibalizing, or it's in resistance to, or it's being resisted by the prior model, which is deeply installed. And so it's not that big companies are not innovative or not understanding. They're conflicted. And a bureaucratic organization is great for staying the course, but it's very challenged when you try to change courses. And so what you see now is startups, of course, don't have that problem at all, right? The startup has no leg. They can go wherever they want. The interesting thing about Facebook, Google, and Amazon is until quite recently, all of them have essentially been adding innovation in the same that is essentially aligned with their initial inertial momentum. So Google's search engine established its inertial momentum. Its economic model to this day still leverages that search engine heavily. It was able to branch out into other things, autonomous driving and adding these other capabilities. But at the end of the day, they didn't conflict. They didn't cause you to want to pull back from search. Right now, we're actually discovering with all three of them that they're getting to the point where they're so large and their social implications have become so large. This whole thing that Facebook's going through with social media right now, what Amazon is going through, and what Google are going through with their marketplaces, and Google, their advertising marketplace, the European Union in both cases is being highly critical of their behavior. So I think we're going to see going forward, they will get these problems eventually. And because once you have inertial momentum, which is a beautiful thing, but once you have it, then the next disruption it's very challenging for you to process it.
Right. And there are startups who might be trying to disrupt them already. Several have already started it, I guess.
Absolutely. And to be fair, there's a criticism that people say, well, they acquire their competitors before they can get big enough to disrupt them. That's fair game. That's okay.
Yes.
And as long as the society is getting more and more benefit, and eventually, by the way, there'll still be somebody that will disrupt them. I mean, that's the way it works.
True. Right. Everything has an end written already when they start. So, yeah, you're right. Somebody will disrupt it and may not get sold, may not get bought by Facebook and Amazons and others.
Exactly.
Fantastic. Exactly. Great discussion. Yeah. Okay. So in your view, in the new book, The Infinite Staircase, what does it teaches us apart from, the physics things, but you do have this metaphysics influences, like on moral principles. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So metaphysics is an interesting word because it can make people think about, magic crystals and, extrasensory perception. I want to use metaphysics and ethics like a strategist because, as you know, I write strategy books. Well, The Infinite Staircase is a strategy book for living. And basically, in a strategy book, you have two responsibilities. The first is you have to analyze the situation, and the second is you have to prescribe an appropriate response. My view is that metaphysics is the most global attempt we have to describing the situation, and ethics is the most global attempt we have to prescribing the response. And so the purpose of ethics is to take advantage of the metaphysics, to align yourself with what's going on, to align yourself with the forces in the situation. So it's very important that you have clear metaphysical understanding in order to understand what ethics to embrace. And by the way, since people's situations can be very different depending on whether you're in a developed country, an underdeveloped country, whether you're in a happy family or a sad, all this kind of thing. The local metaphysics of each person can be very, very different. But you have to understand the situation first and then prescribe the response. And all I was trying to do with Infinite Staircase was try to back up as far as I could and say, okay, if you back up all the way to like Earth, what is going on and how would you proceed? So that was what I was trying to do.
So a holistic point of view of things.
Yeah, that was the idea. Exactly.
Like I said, I cannot wait to sort of start reading it because it already looks so cool. Fantastic. So since my podcast, Jeff, covers these artificial intelligence topics and I invite a lot of guests from that domain as well, may I ask your view on some of the philosophical ideas like morality, free will, determinism, compatibility, and more? The reason why I asked you is that when they're building these artificial general intelligent machines, most of the experts are of the view that, these narrow AI or the artificial intelligence that is built is trying to solve a particular problem. While if you want to build a general intelligence machine, then you would have to understand how the brain works of a biological human, which is controlled by all these emotions, and these philosophical terminologies like free will and determinism. So, yeah, how would technologists decipher these traits and will ever be able to add them to machine then?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think in the short term, the AIs are still tools, and therefore the creator of the AI and the disseminator of the AI have to take ethical and moral responsibility. But your point is right, which is, look, we've seen so much progress in this technology. For me, the one that blew my mind was the self-driving car. I mean, that was the one I just thought, what in the world? But again, you go to the self-driving car and then you give them those ethical problems like, do you brake for the lady with the baby but run into the gas station and blow up the gas station? Those kinds of problems, right? So I think this is going to take a lot of breaking new ground, but I have some ideas about it. And I think the most important one might be, in Infinite Staircase, I talk about ethics being grounded in our mammalian heritage, meaning we get our first ethical impulse, which is kindness, by being nurtured by our mothers. And if you're not nurtured by your mother, you're not here, because babies cannot feed themselves. So basically, as human beings, we internalize kindness before we have language, before we make. So in other words, kindness comes from below. It doesn't have to come from God. It comes from below, from being a baby. So my point about that is, AI doesn't get nurtured.
No.
So AI is much more like a reptile than a mammal. So, and if you think about reptiles are much harder to have ethical interactions with than mammals. Your dog knows when your dog's done a bad thing. Right. But if you had a snake, your snake would not know that. And so I think one of the challenges is going to be, how can you, and so what people are going to try to do is create a reptilian morality, right? I mean, but with rules and with principles and whatever. Right. And my guess is that they can begin to approximate it. But I think we got to be very careful here because you can't negotiate with a reptile. I don't think you're going to be able to negotiate with an AI module. I don't know, but it's obviously going to be. And by the way, wonderful science fiction novels to come to deal with this question. It's a great question.
Yes, absolutely. Can I ask a little bit follow up on that? In your opinion, what will the future hold for humans? Do you think that we are already sort of a cyborg, as Elon Musk says, and we always have these devices with us that can be read by Facebook, Google, everybody. So our lives are not private anymore, and we are sort of supporting that technology, and it's always living with us all the time. So in the future, do you think, like Michio Kaku says, we should merge with artificial intelligence because fighting them might not be an option at all? So yeah, what is your opinion?
Well, so I'm still of an era where artificial intelligence and all the computer things are still, in my mind, adjuncts to living beings. And so, but I can see. I get the idea that at some point there could be a tipping point. And you're a cyborg. That we're using, the Riverside video conferencing system.
Yes.
We're cyborgs, right? I mean, we're doing it right now. I think it's important. This is where I think vision and values, not just for companies, but for individuals, for societies, are so important, because at the end of the day, we want to live in service to something. And my anxiety about the cyborg model is, I know that mammals will live in service to something that will be mammalian and at some level will be universal because we're all mammals. I'm worried about things that are not mammalian and how would even the concept of being in service to even be a meaningful concept in their vision, or would they even have vision and values? You said determinism, free will. Where are we with that? Clearly, they're going to have a lot of choice freedom. I mean, it's demonstrable that you can use that these algorithms can experiment with many alternatives and come up with increasingly successful tactics. So they're going to have very good strategies for living in the sense of perpetuating themselves. I think there's a potential collision course there. I don't think we're there yet, but of course, Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking and Bill Gates have all said, look out, people, it's coming. And so yes. I'm not sure I'm the right guy to deal with it.
Yeah. But I mean, great answer. Yeah. I remember you've written the book Crossing the Chasm in 1990s, and then more versions of it were published later, which all of the world's a huge fan of and was a best-selling book of all time on business management and marketing. Can you talk about it a little bit to the folks who might still not have read it?
Sure. And basically, this was a book about how do you introduce a disruptive innovation into a marketplace and then get it to grow and get adopted. So it's around a model called the technology adoption lifecycle, which, by the way, I did not invent. A guy named Everett Rogers did articles around diffusion of innovation. But the key idea behind that model is there are stages in the adoption where you target different parts of the community who are now ready to adopt. So the early adopters come first, and then we have this Crossing the Chasm group where we call them pragmatists in pain, and then we have the pragmatist herd who wants to go when it's time, and then we have conservatives who want to wait as long as they can. And the point about those four moments, each one requires a different business strategy. And in fact, the strategy that creates success at one moment will create failure at the next moment. So one of the reasons startups have a lot of trouble surviving is they often do their first one well, maybe their second one, but somewhere along the line, they stay on the strategy when it's time to switch to the new one. And that's where I think consultants can help, because as a consultant, you can stand back, you can sort of see patterns, you can say, hey guys, I think it's time. And which is very hard to see when you're in the middle of things. So I think that, so I think by the way, it's predominantly a B2B strategy, business to business. It really doesn't reflect consumer fads. It's much more about markets that develop when people purchase under, they review purchases, they have purchase orders, they think about what they're doing. So that's where it's had the most success.
Because like you said, without these neutral consultants, startups just keep on going in one direction and cannot pivot because it's more egoistic or it's more about will we mess up? And no wonder that then about 99% of startups fail in trying to just steer into one direction while they could have pivoted with the help of a consultant or with the help of an external support.
I think so. By the way, often it's the board of directors too. They really want to catch the wave, and we got to expand. The most common fault we see and I'm an associate with a venture firm, is companies expand their sales forces at the wrong time. So because they have some early success with early adopters, they expand their sales force based on that. It's like, no, you need to actually contract your go-to-market effort and to cross the chasm. It's a very focused effort. And once you've got across the chasm and you've started to build constituencies and build market support, then and only then is it time to expand. But a lot of times the investor's saying, no, we got to go, or the competitor's doing this, we have to copy the competitor. And it's the wrong time, wrong company, wrong outcome. So, yeah.
Absolutely fantastic. And I think the diffusion of innovation states about the early majority, the early adopters, the late majority, the late adopters. But you sort of termed them in a very beautiful way, like pragmatists and conservatives, because that looks more practical than more sort of, no offense to those terms, termed as early majority or early adopters. But I think pragmatists and these terms look more practical in a more practical business sense.
Yeah, I think Everett Rogers was actually just studying it as a data scientist. Right. So he was just describing it. He said the early majority. I mean, he was literally describing a bell curve. And what we were trying to do was translate that into terms that salespeople and marketing people and engineers could understand. So that's why they're more, they call them psychographic terms. But it's like, what's their strategy for living? Why is it the strategy for early adopters work with pragmatists? And it's once you think about it, well, it's obvious. Early adopters want to go first, and pragmatists want the safe buy. I mean, it's like, that's not the same strategy.
That's why we loved, Crossing the Chasm, because it clearly illustrates what's the difference between all of them and how a company can cross that chasm. So yeah, fantastic. Okay, so what is the future of tech as per you? Will artificial intelligence, I've already asked that, but sort of created a new one. Will artificial intelligence become the most dominant force in tech? Or will it stay like a great tool, like you said, that all the technologists will use in any sector of business?
Yeah. I think it's funny. You and I are talking about tech. I always describe myself as a business consultant to high tech. I kind of realized, there isn't a tech sector anymore because with the digital transformation, everything has now become a tech sector. Banking's a tech sector, media's a tech sector, retail's a tech sector, et cetera. So I think that's important. And if you look at what's happening with digital transformation, it really is. We had the systems of record, which were the database systems. We have had those for almost 50 years, computerized, maybe a little bit more. Then we put on top of them what we called systems of engagement. And that was taking mobile and cloud computing, which we were using for consumer purposes, largely media initially. And we said, look, you can put those on top of enterprise systems, and you can talk to your customers and your partners 24/7. This is really great, right? So we had that, but we have some cybersecurity problems because of that, because we're not designed to work together. Set those aside for the moment. And then what we realized, and this is what the Google guys made so clear to me that I didn't get at all when it first came out, the log files from systems of engagement have signals in them about what the user's trying to do, what their propensity is to do the next thing, or what's the propensity of a machine to break down, or what's the propensity of an advertisement to get clicked on, et cetera, et cetera. And so that created systems of intelligence. So when the world's digitally transforming, what's happening right now is everybody already had systems of record. So the later ones are still putting in place their systems of engagement, but the newer ones more modern ones are saying, and we're putting in place our systems of intelligence. And the systems of intelligence let you detect change faster, and it's just like when the organisms went from chemical messaging to electric messaging. We went to neurons when we first got a nervous system. A system of intelligence is just the nervous system, right? And so now we have the nervous system we're installing. And so will AI be permanent? Yes, nervous system. Every living animal has a nervous system, and every living organization will have a nervous system, and it will have AI in.
Fantastic analogy. So it'll work like a nervous system, and you cannot detach it, because detaching it means that the being doesn't exist.
Yeah. Basically, what happens when you detach a system of intelligence is now you're deaf, dumb, and blind. I sometimes say people, if you don't have access to big data and systems of intelligence, you're like a deer wandering out onto the highway, and you can't even. You're going to get hit by a car.
Right. Fantastic. Yes, absolutely right. Are big or small companies who fail because they do not have a great go-to-market strategy? Why couldn't they innovate even though they have enough cash? Some of them were sitting on great cash before they failed. Can you please talk about it in the context of Zone to Win? My favorite book, by the way. Yeah.
Well, thank you. So the idea behind Zone to Win was just, look, Crossing the Chasm gave a strategy for how you'd bring a disruptive innovation to market. It was oriented towards startups. So basically the idea was either you're going to succeed at this, or you're going to die. You're not conflicted.
Right.
You know where you're going. In a big company, established enterprise, you have a core business. And by the way, it's funding everything. And by the way, your shareholders, including your shareholders getting dividends and all that good stuff. Now, all of a sudden, the next innovation comes along. First of all, it needs a lot of money. At some point, your core business still wants money. So there's not enough money to go around. And second of all, it's going to lose money before it makes money. So now you're going, I'm going to go backwards. My investors are going to be worried. and my cash hoard, I don't care how much cash I have, it's going to go down, down, down. They're going to get more and more scared. So I think the point about it is it was dealing with the problem of conflictedness. And that's where the zones came in. So what we said, it's a pretty simple model. Said, look, for your core business, 2 zones. The performance zone, that's the annual financial plan. Understand that. Everybody sees it. You report out on it every quarter. Got it. And the productivity zone, which is all the cost centers behind the scenes necessary to run a performance zone. All of finance, all of HR, IT, facilities, marketing, customer, everything, anything you don't charge your customer for directly is in the productivity zone. And those two zones are 90+% of the budget. I mean, this is your business, right? Then the other two zones are for things that would disrupt that. And we call them the incubation zone and the transformation zone. And the key with the incubation zone was, look, we can't govern the projects that you do there are actually antagonistic to your core business. So you have to sequester, you have to do it outboard. Interestingly, you also have to be outboard of your productivity zone, because your productivity zone has rules and processes and regulations and reviews, all of which are like, we're still trying to find product market fit in the incubation zone. Leave us alone. And so the number one was created. Actually, a lot of companies do that, but then they make the mistake immediately. They don't hold it accountable. They know that they can't hold it accountable to the performance zone metrics. They know they can't hold it accountable to the productivity zone process standards. So they don't hold it accountable to anything. Well, that's crazy. That doesn't work. So the venture capital community has a set of accountability metrics built into an operating model. And what the incubation zone said is use that method to manage your incubation zone. And we talk all about how you would do that. And then the last one is the transformation zone. And the idea there is if you get something in the incubation zone that could be the next big thing, you are going to have to fund it. You are going to have to make all these sacrifices. You can do it provided you understand that you prioritize transformation above everything else when you do it. So you shouldn't do it very often, but when you do it, it's more important than the performance zone. It's more important than the productivity zone. It's like open heart surgery. You have to get through this or you're going to leave yourself on the operating table. And the two examples I used, one was Salesforce, which is when it had to get into marketing beyond sales and service cloud. And then Microsoft, when it was threatened by Amazon Cloud and it had to get into computing. And in both those cases, the CEO, Mark Benioff, and the CEO, Satya Nadella, made transformation the number one priority, and both companies got through it. But there are 54 companies at the beginning of that book that tried and failed and tried and failed and tried and failed because at the end of the day, they really couldn't make the transformation zone the number one priority. And so they kind of waffled back and forth, and you can't waffle in a transformation.
That's true. That's true. And a fantastic consulting that, was provided by you there because, as we know, I mean, they were on very, very steep curve of growth and then suddenly it stagnated and, the competitors were looming large on them. So, fantastic. Then can I ask you a follow-up on that? What kind of startups, like you've talked about Microsoft and Salesforce, but what kind of startups then sort of understand this difference from when you consult to them? What kind of startups, and were they successful when they did that?
Yeah, we've seen this zoning practice. It's a very high success intervention. You don't have to be a Salesforce or an Intel or a Microsoft or a Google, but what you do have to do is say, but I have a core business today. And I am currently valued around my core business. And now I want to embrace an initiative that will take time, attention, budget, away from my core business. And by the way, it will lose money long before it'll make money. So you can be a $100 million company, you can be a $10 million company and have that problem. If you have that problem, then you want to zone your business. And all the zone says is, look, each of those four zones, well, first of all, most of the time there's only three zones. Transformations, you can take an incubation and put it into the performance zone without going through a transformation if you can kind of just transition it in gradually. So that's usually a safe bet. But anyway, those three zones, we got to honor them. Each zone has to understand that the other two zones are totally legitimate, have their own rules, but each zone has to say, we play by our rules, they get to play by their rules. And then during the budgeting process, we should allocate budget by our zones and then compete for budget inside our zone, but not compete for budget across zones because each zone has got a different value proposition.
True.
I mean, it's how to do it.
That's fantastic. Yeah. So there are so many factors how these zones get impacted budget and where the companies right now. what kind of structure the company is and its vision and mission. Fantastic. Great answer. Yeah. So then, connected to that is, how do successful companies target their pragmatists, right? Like you said, in the book, how do they know when they are building the MVP or prototyping that a certain set of users are the one that will carry forward the diffusion of innovation and cross that chasm for them?
It's kind of interesting. So initially, when you're playing, and this is kind of like the incubation zone playbook.
Right.
Because the incubation zone, you should think of it almost like it's a startup business, or more than one startup business. But if I'm running a business in the incubation zone, the first thing I want to do is I want to find some early adopters. We say these are people who believe what you believe, and so they actually lean in. You work together. It's much more like a project than a product. They're not buying a product. It's too new. But they're saying, look, we'll put some people on it. You put your best people on it. Let's build something we both can be proud of. We can be a reference for you, and go forward. And so you put your team on it. And so you learn very quickly from each other. But it's a very it's a visionary idea. It's typically not an idea that most people would have. It's somebody's doing something special. They're going ahead of the herd. Then to cross the chasm, you've got to go to the pragmatic people. Pragmatic people are not visionary. And so what you have to find there is what we call pragmatists in pain. And this is a situation where you're looking for a business process that is broken. I mean, it's causing trouble. And it's not just causing trouble for the department that owns the process. The entire enterprise is going, well, wait a minute. You got to fix this. This is really bad. And so they've done everything they can to fix it. They've used every conventional means they can. It's like, it's not working. It's not fixed. It's not fixed. If you don't fix it, I'll find somebody who can. And those that are going, okay, I will now entertain an offer from somebody from the other side of the chasm, one of these crazy technology disruptors, because I don't have any better ideas. And so then if you're the vendor, what you have to do is say, first of all, is this the problem we can solve? And if it is, then you have to commit to solve the entire problem, which means not only do you have to move your roadmap to focus very specifically on one use case, even though you're supposed to support 1,000 of one use case, in one industry, even though you're planning on going to all industries, one industry, one use case. And then you pull together whoever the partners are that have the stuff that you don't have, and you stay with that customer and that use case in that industry until it's fixed. And when it's fixed, the great news is those pragmatists in pain, they tell their friends, hey, there's a new drug. There's a new vaccine. There's a whatever it is. And so they tell about it. And you end up winning every single customer with that use case in that industry, because they're also, oh my gosh, we've got a solution. And that's when you start to become a real predictable company, because now you have a base of customers at the beginnings of an ecosystem, and you have a predictable sales model. And now you can go to adjacent use cases, adjacent vertical industries, and you can start building out from there. So that's the Crossing the Chasm playbook.
So how you make those pragmatists as the early adopters, and companies do that, the successful ones.
Yes, and then they remember they're not early adopters in the sense that they're voluntarily doing it. They're early adopters because they're under duress. They're being burning platform. They're being forced to the edge to jump into the sea. Yeah.
Fantastic. I think if we have time, we can just keep going on listening and reading to your, topics and to your talks on this topic of crossing the chasm and diffusion of innovation. But thank you, Jeff. I think that's all we had and the questions that we had for you today. I had so much fun and I learned a lot today. So any parting thoughts you have for us?
Well, I do think that for the listeners to your podcast, in this whole notion of the AI and the digital transformation, this is your decade. And so if any of the ideas or frameworks that Vivek and I have been talking about would be helpful to you, I please encourage you to use them, because you're going to have a big impact if you can be successful. And obviously, both of us want you to be successful.
Yes. Fantastic. Because that was the mission and vision of the podcast as well, to sort of create more knowledge to the people who do not understand artificial intelligence and such topics. And so thank you so much, Jeff. And I hope in the future, whenever we could find some time from you, we could sit again and discuss some more of great topics from your books and from from the things that we wanted to ask you.
Well, thank you, Vivek. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Thank you, Jeff. Have a great day. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please support this podcast by liking, commenting, sharing it with your friends, and also subscribing to this channel. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.